We'll get started on if people would probably have done that smoother. Sent it out sooner, right away, rather than after. But hindsight is 20/20. Okay. So we'll get started. I'm going to have sheet, pen. We won't. Unfortunately, 1 Samuel is too long to get into and read. But 1 Samuel, the book all about the transition from judges to kings. And the first one where I get to play lazy and divide the book rather than doing the entire double volume. This time it's justified, but once we get to Isaiah, I'm splitting that into the first part of Isaiah and the second and third, because 66 chapters is just too much. So, what's the basic information? Unfortunately, we don't have too much that's 100% certain. The author is not listed. It is very unlikely that it's Samuel because he dies in 25, and this isn't like where Moses died at the end of Deuteronomy or Joshua died near the end of Joshua. This is before the even halfway point. So it seems fairly clear that it is not the person who it is named after. So again, we have to look at the when and see if that can help us answer the who of the writing. The time of writing, we know that it absolutely cannot be before the death of David, because that's the end of the history, and it seems that it is likely that it is after the death of Solomon and during the time of the divided kingdom, because in 2 Samuel it makes a reference to a town that David captured, which is still held by the kings of Judah to this day. And prior to the divided kingdom, it would have been owned by the kings of Israel. So that seems to point to a divided kingdom, time of writing. But at the same time, it seems that it was before the downfall of Samaria that it was written, because there's no reference or foreshadowing to it. So we can say that it is likely somewhere between about 900 and 722 BC. That's a general estimate. The writer, not 100% certain. There are some guesses. Some people think that it was one of the prophets that was near the time of the downfall. I read one theory that said it was Jonah, one person said Micah, but these... Okay, so if we don't know who the author is, can we at least figure out who the intended audience is? Looking at the themes, we can get an impression for that. Because like all of biblical history, this is not just, let's reset the facts with dates. This is meant to look at the past to teach you a lesson about the future. And the main theme is that God is ultimately the true ruler. You had Samuel, the last of the judges, and from a human perspective, it looks like he was ruling, but no, God was the one who was really ruling. He was the one in charge. Then it passes off to the first king, to Saul. And Saul is an example of a person who very much thought that he was the one ruling, but in the end, God made it clear that No, this kingdom is the Lord's. He is the one who rules, and it is very much within his power to take it away from one king and give it to another person. And David, he was a man after the Lord's own heart. It was not that he did not sin or have any errors, that he was somehow perfect, but he was one who trusted in the Lord and always went back to his grace and remembered that he was the one who was truly the ruler of Israel. And when he forgot that and exploited his power, that's when you get the incident with Bathsheba, which we will get into in 2 Samuel. That kind of got into the themes and literary features as well. But to wrap up the intended audience, it is for kings and the people to teach them who their prosperity truly comes from. Not the human king, but the divine king who ruled all things. Literarily, this is one of the easier ones to read, especially if you're translating it from a different language, because it is straight prose, for the most part. But there are occasionally a few songs spattered in there, a few pieces of poetry, such as the Song of Samuel's Mother in the first part, or David's song at the end, which praises God for all that he did for him, which forms a nice bookend for the greater volume of 1 and 2. Other than that, there is an interesting kind of jumping around where you have very much a main character in Samuel, and then Saul, and then David. But more so than other books, it tends to follow one person, but it is not solely limited to that one person, because it very much jumps to this unrelated thing that is important for filling out the picture, which we see an example of the sort with the Ark in captivity. That's 5 through 7.
When was the time of this book?
It was about 956 is the end. So about circa 1000, you would say, the general time. 956, I believe, is the death of David. I have to double check, but a little over 1000 to about 950.
Okay.
Well, for 1st and 2nd Samuel combined.
For both.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, more than 40 or 50 years.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe 1100 AD.
Yeah.
Like that. 1180. Okay. 10 AD.
Because Samuel's reign very much overlaps with the time of the judges.
Okay.
So, what happened in the book? We have, we kind of have 3 arcs in the first book. One where it is entirely Samuel ruling, then the rule gets passed on to Saul, but then when Saul abandons God, we see Saul's fall and David's rise. And then in 2 Samuel, it's all David, all the way down. but with the birth of one of the main characters. That's how you know it's going to be a good one. Samuel's mother was married to a Levite who had 2 wives. One of them, Samuel's mother, did not have any children yet, while the other wife had multiple, and in a society where Samuel's soon-to-be mother was very much divided, insulted by the other wife, and put down even if the husband loved her. And went into the tabernacle, prayed to God silently, which was so weird at the time that the high priest Eli thought that she was drunk. And then Eli blessed her for praying to God and her dedication. And, as is not a good example for people to follow, into your service. God did not answer her prayer because he made a deal. God answered her prayer because of grace and her faith. But she followed through with her promise. And Eli was where she got more children. So she lived happily ever after. Of the actual anointed priesthood. Eli's son's presence, like some kind of magic spell that they could control, and tried to compel him to fight for them by bringing the orc out to fight for them. In shock, he fell over and broke his neck on the stool, the spiritual leader of Israel at the time. Brought into captivity in Galatia, in Philistia, and put in the temple of their god Dagon, but in reality, God's not brought into captivity with them. They're stuck there with him. And the statue of Dagon was struck down, fell on its face so that it was effectively bowed down. And after they set it back up and it happened again, they said, something's going wrong here. And then a plague struck them. And they're like, you know what? Not worth it. We're getting this out of here. And so they sent it back on a court that, by all natural rights, should have gone back because newborn calves do not just wander off somewhere. They try to find their mothers. But God showed that he was the one in control, and he led the calves back to Israel, where the ark was not put back in the tabernacle, but pretty much kept in someone's house, because that's where it ended up.
He was blessed.
And he was very blessed.
Yeah.
But back to the greater state of Israel. After Eli completely failed as the spiritual leadership of Israel, Samuel stepped up and became the judge of Israel from the tribe of Levi. And he led them well. They had victory after victory, and God delivered them. And he set up, as a reminder, the stone Ebenezer. Evan, stone, Ezer, help. The stone of help. To remind people how God helped them. And we don't really get a lot about Saul's time as that. We're supposed to take on the role of judging, but unfortunately, they were corrupt. What he learned from Eli, he unfortunately did not correct.
Clarification, you said that Eli was a terrible, horrible leader, or however you put it. But he taught Samuel about God, so he did something right.
Yeah. It was probably unfair to say that he was a terrible spiritual leader, but
He was a terrible parent.
True. And somewhat of a poor pushover. He loved his kids more than he loved God. Which we might look into on the discussion questions on the back with Eli and Samuel, but hold that thought. But after the time skip, we see people saying, yeah, Samuel, you're great, but your kids aren't. The woodwork together, everyone. We just want someone that we can always look to, and then look to their kids and their kids and their kids to lead us as king. And their hearts were not in the right place, because it's not because they wanted just, okay, we want God to lead us, but we don't want the confusion about who we're supposed to look to. We want someone that we know we're supposed to look to. They wanted to be like everyone else and not ruled by God. And so God gave them what they asked for. Saul. He was every inch a king, including the couple inches that he was head and shoulders above everyone else. So, sure, he wasn't from a great clan, but he was fairly well off. He had the physique for it, and God showed that the Lord was ultimately the one who allowed him to be king. His spirit came on Saul, and he led the people in deliverance against their enemies. Unfortunately, that did not remain. As Samuel warned them, the king that they chose, in the sinfulness of their hearts, did not remain dedicated to God. In the Amalekite campaign, rather than doing as God said, Saul decided, let's keep the plunder, and we'll sacrifice that. God likes sacrifices, right? And we get that famous line, God requires obedience more than sacrifice. And so, after God rejected Saul, or perhaps it might be more clearly said that Saul rejected God, and God said, okay, have it your way, but this is still my kingdom. God sent Samuel to go and show me your sons. First one, oh, he's tall and impressive. Surely it's this one. No. What about the next one? He's tall and impressive too. No. Again and again and again, all of the older sons, until finally, it's not what's on the outward, but the Lord looks at the heart. And David, the one who was left out, still doing work, the least important of all his brothers, gets brought in and anointed as the next king. And told to move by all his brothers who are totally being cool with that. And so, that is then put very publicly, as the story continues on, with David and Goliath, where we see Saul shaking in his sandals, while David, in full confidence in the Lord, goes out. Yeah, Saul, I'm not gonna go out wearing your armor, pretending to be you. Don't need your protection. I'm not used to this. I'm gonna go out as I'm used to, as a shepherd with my sling, which don't think of like modern day kids' toy slingshots. Good sized stone slung at a speed. They could get that going very quickly, and it was very much able to kill. So it's not. So on the one hand, no, it's not like he was going out there completely unprepared, putting God to the test. But on the other hand, common standards would say, yeah, that's not likely to work. But God was on his side, depending on the translation, struck either the forehead or the knee.
Never heard that.
A lot of the helmets had armor on the forehead. So some people put forward the hypothesis that it was not forehead but the knee, which then when it struck the knee caused him to fall over, and because of his height, bigger they are, the harder they fall. Either way, David wins by God's deliverance, cuts off the giant's head, and is acclaimed as the great champion. And Saul is very, very nervous because if anyone has studied history, there's nothing that is a greater danger to an unpopular king than a popular general. And so, first thing he does, let's try and get him killed by sending him out on even more dangerous things. Oh, he won. That backfired. The next one, David fell in love with one of Saul's daughters. He'll marry into my family, and then he'll be able to be controlled. With the bride price of 300 Philistine foreskins, because he was a warrior. But that was not enough. Saul's jealousy over David continued to grow and grow, with multiple attempted murders even before David fled, until eventually it culminated in David deciding to flee, where he left the house and his wife behind with an idol that was put some hair on it and put it under the bed covers, which that doesn't speak well about Saul's daughter or Saul, that they just had an idol just sitting around, but whatever. And so, after that, David was on the run as a fugitive, and his first stop was the tabernacle. Now, it says something about David that the first place he goes is to the representative of God's presence. He gets bread, the sacred showbread, and he gets the sword from Goliath, whom he had already killed. Unfortunately, that doesn't quite go well, as we'll see later. But after he receives provisions from the Lord through the tabernacle, he flees to the one place where Saul won't be able to follow him, Philistine territory. But then reality ensued, as people recognized him, because who wouldn't recognize the guy who killed their great champion? And so David faked insanity. And when they saw him scratching at the posts of the city gate with spittle running down his beard, they said, "Let's just let him go." And so David continued fleeing. Meanwhile, Saul followed David and heard, he went to the tabernacle at Nob. And, you helped David. Wait, what? Yeah, he's your servant, isn't he? You helped him die! And despite what they said, despite them having no idea that David was on the run, even though David had shown multiple times that he was loyal to Saul, Saul was very much on the downside of madness, and to very much solidify that he had rejected God, he killed almost all of the priests, with only Zadok remaining alive, who then went to David. And so David continued on, pulling pulling a sort of Robin Hood before it was cool, going around helping people when Saul was not able. He went and saved this town of Keilah from the Philistines, but then news of that spread, and Saul heard, oh, David's in Keilah. And so, an interesting theological point here. David asked God, will the people of Keilah turn me over to Saul? And God said, yes, they will. So, David left. Now, as you hear this, you probably think, okay, what's so interesting about that? But God said, God knows everything, right? So, He'd know that. So God said that they would turn him over, but they didn't have the chance to because David left, meaning that God does not just know what will happen, as if time is only one possible way, but He knows what could happen because David's choice to leave made God's assurance that the people would turn him over not happen. So yes, free will does exist, but God still does know what will happen. Tangents. So then we get the first instance where David spares Saul's life. Saul went and followed the trail. He heard that David was in Keilah. He can't have gone far. And they're hiding in a cave nearby. And Saul goes in to relieve himself while David's hiding in the cave. So he creeps up, cuts off the corner of Saul's robe. All of David's men were saying, come on, God is very obviously putting him in your hand, kill him, take the throne, but David's not going to do that. Cut a piece off his robe, showed it to Saul. Okay, Saul, I could have done it, but out of respect for your position as the Lord's representative to his people, even though you rejected him, I still spared your life. And so Saul had a moment of emotional contrition. Oh, David, my son, come back, I won't kill you again. But at this point, David knew better and went on his way and spent a year in the service of Nabal, whose name means fool. But then at the end of it, Nabal refused to pay them. And so David was justifiably mad, but then was about to go for a perhaps unjustifiably rampage of killing everyone in Nabal's family, when the godly woman Abigail went out, gave them a payment, and soothed David's anger. It is an interesting, not only a good name, but also an interesting example of a woman taking action and leadership where men fail without assuming headship. And then Nabal died of a heart attack after he heard what had happened, and David married Abigail. And then, because Saul very much did not learn his lesson, he went to kill David again, and David went and spared Saul's life again, this time even more miraculously, because the entire camp was sleeping. He went, took the water jug and spear from right beside Saul's head while he was sleeping, and said, hey, Saul, he's familiar, I'll do this again. And so then he went and lived among the Philistines, serving, in very heavy quotation marks, the king of Gath, all the while pulling the wool over his eyes by going and destroying Philistine and other enemies of Israel's cities, while claiming that, yeah, I went and destroyed this town of Israel. Meanwhile, Saul was not doing so hot. He went and saw the army that was arrayed against him, and rather than turning to the Lord, whose priest he had killed, he said, okay, I need some kind of supernatural power on my side. Yeah, sure, and when I was younger and still kind of following what God said, I cast out all the magicians and enchanters and such, but, I really need the help of one right now. And so Saul went to the forest moon, the witch of Endor, and asked to call up Samuel. And the news he got, he probably should have expected, considering Samuel's stance on things. But he received the assurance that you will die today. And we get the assurance that trust in the Lord, not in the wizards that peep, as Isaiah will say later. And then meanwhile, in contrast to that, we see David, rather than, again, he passively saves Saul's life by refusing to go to battle with the people of Israel and the house of Saul. But when he goes back, he sees, oh man, the Amalekites have attacked his home, taken him and his group's family, and he turns to the Lord. What shall we do? And the Lord answers him, go, be victorious. And he saves his family. Meanwhile, in contrast, Saul faces utter defeat. Him and all his sons were wiped out. Him and all his sons who were in the battle were wiped out. And he himself, seeing the losing battle, decides, okay, I'm not going to be taken captive. First asks his armor-bearer to kill him, but his armor-bearer won't do it. He does it himself, falls on his own sword. And thus ends 1 Samuel with the end of the first very disastrous king of Israel. You can only go up from there, right?
Does his armor bearer go and tell David that he killed Saul?
No, his armor-bearer commits suicide. One of the other people in the army of Israel went and found David and claimed to be the one who killed Saul, which then either he was lying, or we have a case where Saul fell on his sword, still didn't die, and then he found the king not quite dead, and then finished him off, and then went and told David. Either way, David did not take kindly to someone either claiming or actually killing the king. It wasn't even, especially when it was supposed to be their king, whether Saul told him to or not. Any other questions or comments?
When Saul goes and visits this witch of Endor, she calls up Samuel.
Mm-hmm.
Samuel says, why do you consult me now that the Lord has turned away from you and become your enemy? So, at that point, Saul is God's enemy. The Lord has done what he predicted through me. The Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hands and given it to one of your neighbors, to David, because you did not obey the Lord or carry out his fierce wrath against the Amalekites. The Lord has done this to you today. The Lord will hand over both Israel and you to the Philistines, and tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. Now that confuses me because Saul is the classic example of somebody who's turned away from God. Mm-hmm. Is Samuel saying you will be with me or you will be with the Lord? I guess he's saying this me, Samuel.
Yes. So and with the benefit of hindsight, we think of the afterlife in terms of heaven and hell as two different places. Meanwhile, the Israelites kind of had a general lump of, you're dead, you're in the grave, and your spirit is with God, or your spirit is in torment, but because of so many cults and false teachings in the area at the time, they very much highlight, don't go consulting for dead people, leave them as they are. The afterlife, you're done, you don't speak to the living. And they don't have as much emphasis as the New Testament on heaven and hell, it's just the grave. And so Samuel, who is dead in the grave, says to Saul, you and all your sons will be with me, that is, in the grave.
Okay. I made this note to myself that in chapter 13 I had Saul's big sin. He really turned away from God when what he was not supposed to
Sacrifice.
And he did.
Mm-hmm.
Was that what really angered God?
It was a sign of things to come, really, where he still wanted. Trying to think of a good example. At what point is a glass full? Or at what point does something fall over? If you just keep pushing this, eventually it's going to tip over the edge. What tap is ultimately the tap that caused God to say, the kingdom isn't yours anymore, was the Amalekite. But trying to take the control of God and impel him to help them on his own hands was another tap. It's pushing it a little further. This is very stable.
Well, in chapter 11, Saul is talking to the people, and he's telling them that, he takes this oxen and chops it up, and he says to them, this is what will be done to the oxen of anyone who does not follow. And he says, Saul and Samuel. So at that point in chapter 11, he's still thinking of not his own kingship, but Samuel's spiritual leadership. And I wonder about the two, there's like two anointings, or there's the anointing and then the confirmation of Saul. It's like they did it twice.
There was, on the sheet I had that there's one that he's anointed to show him that God has chosen you. The other one was a public anointing to show all of Israel, God has chosen Saul. And Samuel was kind of dead by the time that David went to claim his kingship, so he didn't get the same kind of treatment. But
I had kind of wondered about Abigail's behavior. I mean, her husband was a moron, okay?
a fool. His name means fool.
Very moron. But I kind of think, man, that was a really choosy thing to do. She kind of went behind her husband's back, and I mean...
Otherwise he ended up killed. Oh, she saved him.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Arlene, if you were being a jerk, she'd go behind your back. Please don't be mad at him. Stop it.
Yeah, it's one of those things where all of all of Nabal's men said, yeah, you should pay these guys. You should do this. They earned it.
Yeah.
And if you don't, it's going to end pretty poorly for you. And so when as Luther said, when the men fail to lead properly, the women must step up. Went behind his back. He probably wasn't happy, but again, he is a fool.
Well, did he even realize it? I mean, he died
She-
shortly after.
She told him what she did, and that's why he died.
She made bread and fat and she did a lot of provisions.
Mm-hmm.
I admire her. And we're gonna have to close here pretty soon.
Yeah.
But we have to go here pretty soon.
Yeah. 26:36. Abigail came to Nabal and saw that he was holding a feast in his house, a feast fit for a king. Nabal was in good spirits because he had drunk a lot. So she told him nothing at all until the morning light. In the morning, when the wine had worn off for Nabal, his wife told him about these things, and his heart died within him, and he became like a stone. About 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal, and he died.
Oh.
That's a bad way to go.
In modern, it might be, yeah, you might say in modern terms that he basically had a stroke. Enough time for, but why wait 10 days?
It may have taken, let's say he was unable to drink water or eat food, it may have taken him 10 days to die.
Give him time to rest.
I have a feeling it can work out.
Yeah.
We don't know.
Anything else before